Education in conflict areas, moving forward in dark times. The Safe Schools Declaration is the instrument through which states can express broad political support for the protection and continuation of education in armed conflict. It sets out 5 concrete commitments to protect education, protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. Attacks on education occur on a regular basis. More than 28 countries globally have experienced attacks on education. This is a major global issue. The GCPEA reported more than 1,000 individual attacks on education within just 9 countries. Education allows people to acquire knowledge and learn new life skills to become better citizens and to lead happier and more successful lives. However, many countries face severe barriers in their access to education. In Afghanistan and Nigeria, students and educators have faced several targeted killings, threats and abductions. These attacks occur all around the world, especially in countries affected by insecurity, conflict and weak systems of human rights protections. Educational facilities are increasingly being used by parties as bases, barracks or detention centres. This exposes young children to harm and denies children access to education, which deprives communities of the chance to build their future. In Israel and Palestine, teachers and pupils were injured and arrested if they protested military presence in their schools. It is not just school infrastructure that is damaged, but the ambitions of a whole generation of children. Schools should be safe environments where children can work towards a better future for their communities. Instead, there is a global pattern of targeted violent attacks on education by state security and non-state armed groups. Thus, as the reports of these attacks increase globally, macro approaches have been created to prevent such attacks and address their impact. The Safe Schools Declaration framework is one of the preventative measures imposed by international organisations as an intergovernmental political commitment to protect education during armed conflict. 86 of the UN member states have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration to protect students, teachers, schools and universities from attack. The second area of implementation the Safe Schools Declaration sets out is the importance of data collection in response to attacks on education during armed conflict. Data collection needs to be carried out on a national level and be monitored and reported to analyse any data gaps to determine what information on attacks and military use is available and what is needed. This information can help sustain education, as understanding the barriers that affect education can help create well-informed protection programmes and policies that are context-specific. These policies are implemented on a micro level in communities affected by armed conflict. If effective in practice, it can have a positive effect not just on local communities but for the whole world. Often, incidents that occur on a micro level are felt on a macro level scale through social stability and loss of economy. The next recommendation the Safe Schools Declaration sets out is the strengthening the protective role of education in armed conflict. It is important that education is sustained, as Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights plainly states everyone has the right to education. Accordingly, educational infrastructures need to be re-established where possible so that education could be continued. International organisations such as UNESCO and the United Nations play a key role in their macro approach towards sustaining education. Through their declarations and aims, they create and disseminate a world culture. Therefore, the globalisation of education can reduce discriminatory attitudes through teaching children skills that will enable them to combat prejudice, discrimination and injustice. Education that is conflict sensitive avoids contributing to conflict and pursues a contribution to peace. Education is at the heart of change. It is needed to help fight the issues that affect the world through teaching young people positive values and attitudes. Thus, new pedagogies and resources that are approved by international organisations could be the answer to solving some of the world's most devastating issues, such as racism, unequal opportunities and class division. However, this view is largely disputed as the World System Analysis perspective sheds light on the negative aspects of globalisation within education, arguing international organisations have hidden agendas. Whilst promoting goals of poverty reduction, development and education for all, they are perpetuating existing dominant power relationships between countries so that more developed countries keep their hegemony. Furthermore, the cultural and intellectual sovereignty of smaller, relatively powerless states will have their customs, beliefs and ways of life undermined by globalisation, as they will have to adapt to the global culture imposed by international organisations. If they do not accept or follow the global culture, they are at risk of not being able to compete in the global economy, which will have dire consequences for that country on a national and local level. The Safe Schools Declaration highlights the importance of political support for the protection of education during armed conflict. The guidelines presented in this declaration were developed over several years of consultation with governments, armed forces and international organisations. This further reinforces the notion that there may be hidden agendas within the rhetoric of this declaration, as the fourth guideline encourages these parties to meet on a regular basis to review the implementation of the declaration. However, sustaining education must reach beyond macro-level intervention, especially when mid-level and grassroots institutions have little say over the policies and practices that affect the lives of average citizens. Local school teachers and pupils should have the opportunity to voice their needs and concerns, as they are the target audience. It seems the only power given to locals is the responsibility to report and collect data of attacks on education, so that government officials and international organisations can make informed decisions. The unequal power relationship between local, national and international groups may have a significant effect on education. Policies such as the Safe Schools Declaration should ensure everyone's views are acknowledged and respected, including those whose education is affected by armed conflict. We should increase opportunities for citizens to understand their lives within a global context and make informed decisions so they can play an active role in their local and global community. The last guideline of the Safe Schools Declaration is considered the best defence for deterring attacks on school. To prevent unlawful attacks against students, teachers and educational facilities, there needs to be effective accountability mechanisms in place. Those who target schools need to be held accountable by being brought to trial. A country's government has a duty to provide effective disciplinary actions for breaches of international human rights law and humanitarian law. Furthermore, commanders have a duty to make sure their troops know their obligations to prevent any violations. If attacks on education are reported and the perpetrators are brought to trial, this may deter further attacks. Threats of attack and attacks that have taken place can cause severe and long-lasting harm to individuals and societies. Access to education may be undermined by military presence, causing educational facilities to be blocked, or educational personnel and students may stay away, fearing for their safety. If the Safe Schools Declaration can help reduce the amount of military involvement and help victims of education attacks through effective accountability mechanisms, then this framework can help sustain education. The safety and well-being of children and educational professionals should be our biggest concern in areas of armed conflict. Maslow's hierarchy of needs show a person's physiological and safety needs must be satisfied before progressing on to meet higher-level growth needs. Schools can alleviate the psychological impact of armed conflict by offering routine, stability and peer support. This can help students and teachers to cope with conflict and recover from psychological distress or trauma. Education is fundamental to development and to the full enjoyment of human rights and freedoms. However, this development depends on the child's access to education. Consequently, it is of paramount importance that educational facilities are safe places. Attacks on education can reduce the likelihood that children will return to school. This can have a colossal impact on the country's ability to rebuild its national economy, which in turn influences the stability of the world. In conclusion, the Safe Schools Declaration provides a set of guidelines that can be used as a step towards sustaining education. It is vital that countries adopt a conflict-sensitive approach to education to reduce the risk of stigma, isolation, intra-community tensions, marginalisation and even radicalisation. Establishing education policies and programmes that reduce the causes of tension between groups and that increase social cohesion across groups contributes to building peace. This can lead to a future where the likelihood of attacks on education and military use of schools can be reduced through promoting a peace-building trajectory. The Safe Schools Declaration contains a lot of useful conflict prevention strategies. However, these macro approaches are only effective if implemented sufficiently on a local micro level. The contributions of those affected by educational attacks, the very people the Declaration aims to help, could improve the impact the Declaration has. If the strategies and recommendations were created in collaboration between local, national and international organisations, then the Declaration would provide a more holistic understanding. However, as it stands, as mentioned previously, there are unequal power relations. It is unfair to expect societies to accept and implement policies and practices that they have had little control over. International organisations leaders need to understand that to successfully implement any policy or practice, there needs to be multi-agency collaboration between people at all levels. Otherwise, frameworks such as the Safe Schools Declaration may run the risk of failing to sustain education and be considered merely rhetoric. This is not an option. Children have a fundamental right to education, to pave their way to a bright future even in times of darkness.